Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell if you enjoy this episode. In late January of 2002, horror returned to a town which has in many ways been forever linked to a terrifying school shooting. Bobby Zajac, Erin Golla, and James Springer were at the AMF Broadway Lanes bowling alley in Littleton, Colorado. Just after closing, an unidentified suspect produced a weapon and initiated a robbery. Moments later, that robbery became a triple murder. Authorities were left with few pieces of evidence to examine and no clear indication of motive. At least two separate witnesses saw strange men at the bowling alley that night, though their descriptions indicate two vastly different suspects. Over the course of the past 18 years, police have exhausted avenues trying to determine who could have been responsible for the grisly murders. At different times, evidence has pushed them in various directions. Was this a targeted attack linked to a drug ring? Was the killer the same man who would, just over a month later, commit a double murder before taking his own life? Could it have been a random crime with no solid links to Littleton? Or does someone local know exactly what happened? This is Trace Evidence, episode 138, The Littleton Bowling Alley Triple Homicide. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine a truly terrifying triple homicide. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter at TraceEvPod, Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. The show is also available on MeWe and Minds. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon available at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions directly through the website or email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. 3 people murdered in cold blood. 3 families shattered in an act of madness. Nearly 2 decades later, and their killer remains free, perhaps to kill again. This is episode 138, The Littleton Bowling Alley Triple Homicide. Littleton, Colorado is an area which, for many, has become synonymous with one of the most brutal and haunting mass shootings in American history. While most people refer to that shooting by the name of the school in which it happened, Columbine, Littleton was inexorably tied to the tragedy of that harrowing day. For the citizens of Littleton, it's a dark mark they will never forget, but one which they wish didn't hang over their town for the remainder of time. Like any other place, though, Littleton has its share of crimes unrelated to that for which it is most infamous. In episode 99, I covered the double homicide of Nick Kunzelman and Stephanie Hart Grizel. On February 13, 2000, just 10 months after that terrible school shooting, 15-year-old Nick and 16-year-old Stephanie were shot and killed at a Subway sandwich shop just a few blocks from where the school shooting had taken place. Despite the horror of the crime, its close chronological proximity to the mass shooting, coverage has been minimal, and 20 years later, police are still trying to determine who exactly killed Nick and Stephanie. Somehow, this double homicide fell between the cracks, whether it was the lack of information, the utter lack of media coverage, or something else. Many residents of Littleton aren't even aware that it occurred. Just 2 years later, there would be another set of murders which, for reasons passing understanding, has received even less attention than the double homicide of Nick and Stephanie. This time, it would occur in January of 2002 at the AMF Broadway Bowling Lanes, just 6 miles to the west of Columbine High School, and still, 18 years later, it remains unsolved and but for a handful of short, undetailed articles, almost completely unreported. When you say the words bowling alley shooting, most people immediately think of the horrifying massacre which took place some 12 years earlier in Las Cruces, New Mexico. On the morning of February 10, 1990, 7 people were shot, 4 of them killed, by 2 yet unidentified men who robbed the bowling alley, setting it on fire as they left. Coverage has been extensive. There have been documentaries, podcasts, books, and countless articles examining every known detail, a minute-by-minute timeline of that atrocious crime. Despite that coverage, the identities of the killers remain unknown. Perhaps, in the case of Broadway Lanes, it could be the absence of coverage which has played such a major role in the lack of developments and the failure to identify a suspect. That takes us to Sunday, January 27, 2002. 23-year-old Bobby Zajac was, by all accounts, a natural when it came to bowling. Bobby had proven his bowling ability time and time again, winning multiple awards and rings signifying the numerous times he'd bowled a 300, a perfect score that is by no means an easy task. While Bobby was making plans to earn a college degree, likely in the area of accounting, there were always whispers about his skills, and the question would ultimately be asked: would he be going pro? Unfortunately, that was a question Bobby would never have the chance to answer. While Bobby was hitting strike after strike, 29-year-old James Springer was finishing up his shift as the manager that night. Springer, who had only been working at Broadway Lanes for a little over a month, was planning to give Bobby a ride home once the final closing procedures were finished. James was a large man, but a kind one, described by many as a gentle giant, the type of guy who stood up for the underdog and didn't like to see anyone mistreated. At approximately 20 minutes to midnight, James picked up the phone and dialed his wife to let her know he'd be home soon, right after he dropped off Bobby. The father of 2 didn't have a lot left to get done, and he was looking forward to getting home, seeing his wife and 2 children. But sadly, like Bobby, he would never make it home that night. Around the same time James made his call home, Erin Golla dialed up a friend who was going to pick her up that night. The 26-year-old mother of 2 daughters had been working the snack counter at the bowling alley for the past 2 months and seemed to enjoy the atmosphere. It was a familiar world as her father, Ron, had owned and operated Roller City, a popular skating rink where Erin spent countless hours as a child whirling around the rink and having a blast with her friends. By all accounts, the trio should have vacated the premises sometime before midnight, making their ways home, Erin with her friend, and James dropping off Bobby along the way. At approximately 11:50 p.m., Erin's friend arrived, but Erin didn't come outside. It wouldn't be all that unusual for Erin to wait inside. It was a cold Colorado night with temperatures dipping down into the 20s, but it was strange for her to not come walking out within moments of her ride's arrival. On this night, Erin's friend arrived and saw an unidentified man exiting the building, climbing into a truck, and driving away. She didn't know who he was, though Erin's friend assumed he was either an employee she hadn't seen before or perhaps a customer who had hung around, causing Erin to be a little late. However, after several minutes passed and Erin still had not emerged from the building, her friend walked inside, calling out her name. There was no answer. It would be in the back office where this friend would come upon a grisly scene, screaming out before running to dial 911. By the time police arrived, Erin, Bobby, and James were all dead. Robert William Zajac was born on September 16, 1978. According to his father, Roy, Bobby was a smart, focused, and driven young man. Bobby was athletic as a child, playing in Little League, and while he was skilled, it was bowling which he most took to. When he was just 9, Bobby would head down to the lanes with his father and Jeffrey, his brother. From the first time he bowled, he just fell in love with it, and over the years he would sharpen that skill. Outside of the lanes, Bobby was a fun-loving guy who often worked 2 jobs, from pizza delivery to grocery store clerk. He enjoyed hiking the mountains and experiencing the outdoors. While Bobby had worked for AMF Lanes and Highlands Ranch, some 8 miles south of Littleton, many of his friends spent their time at Broadway Lanes, and so Bobby would often make the trip to hang out, bowl, and have a good time. According to Roy, Bobby had gone through a bit of a struggle in the later half of 2001. He had broken up with a long-term girlfriend and was down about it, but as the year came to an end, he was putting everything back together. He was looking at college with a pursuit of accounting. He'd recently been offered a job working for the Colorado Department of Transportation. Good pay with great benefits. On that fateful Sunday night, though, Bobby found himself at his old go-to, Broadway Lanes. He'd been around enough to forge a friendship with the manager, James, who was giving him a ride home. James Springer Jr. was born on May 2, 1972, in Connecticut. When he was just 9, the family pulled up stakes and moved west, settling in Cache Valley, Utah. James was an avid outdoorsman from a young age, loving to camp, hike, and fish alongside his father. He would go on to attend Skyview High School, graduating in 1990. Jim, as he was often called, had one sibling, a sister named Donna, and it was his delight when she eventually married, as he would become an uncle. According to family, the kids referred to him as Awesome Uncle Jim. It became quite clear that Jim not only would make a great father, but he desperately wanted to be one. In 1999, he went on to marry his wife, Jennifer. The couple would have 2 children, both sons born in 2000 and 2001. When asked to describe his son, James Springer Sr. told the Desert News, quote, "He was my partner. We hunted, we fished together. I coached his Little League baseball team and went to every high school football game. He was a large boy. He just stuck up for everybody who was more or less the underdog. He was very protective." End quote. James eventually began working for AMF, a company which has become synonymous with bowling and bowling equipment. Throughout his time with AMF, James was offered several jobs. Around the time of the horrible terror attacks of September 11th, he turned down an offer to move to New York, concerned for the safety of his family. He was later offered a position in Salt Lake City, though he would turn this one down as well, as there were some security concerns revolving around the incoming Olympics in 2002. A man always focused on what was best for his family, he ultimately accepted an offer which would send him to Littleton, Colorado. Jim was excited about the opportunity and moving into a new area where he could raise his family. He officially began work on December 3rd, but tragically would lose his life just a little over 7 weeks later. Erin Courtney Golla was born on October 14, 1975 in Denver and would have a brother and a sister. Smart, athletic, and talented, Erin thoroughly enjoyed skating at her father's rink, in addition to swimming and ballet. Erin went on to attend Bear Creek High School. Before completing her time there, she moved in with a boyfriend. She would eventually marry to a man named Kevin, through whom she would have 2 beautiful daughters. Sadly, while Erin's marriage would end in divorce, her love for her daughters and dedication to providing them with a better life was unceasing. Erin picked up a job working the lunch counter at Broadway Lanes in late November of 2001, just 2 months prior to the shooting. Sunday, January 7th was, for the most part, an average day at Broadway Lanes. Both James Springer and Erin Golla were working the closing shift. That evening, there was another employee, the bartender who went by the name Taz. When interviewed by KMGH-TV, he explained that nothing stood out to him about the day, saying, quote, "When I clocked out last night, it was about 11:15. I called my wife and I just drove out of the parking lot. I thought it was just another normal day, normal night, until I heard about it on the radio this morning." End quote. Clocking out at 11:15 p.m. makes Taz one of the last people to see Bobby, James, and Erin alive. We know that the bowling alley was scheduled to close at 11:30, meaning Taz likely issued last call and shut down the bar, leaving slightly before closing time. After 11:30, it would be standard procedure for the doors to be locked while James and Erin finished up their tasks, which were usually related to cleaning up, pulling cash drawers, and locking the safe. Approximately 10 to 15 minutes after closing, Erin Golla placed a call to her friend who was set to pick her up that night. Around the same time, James called his wife Jennifer and said, quote, "I'm done closing. We're waiting for Erin's ride. Then I'll give Bobby a ride, and then I'll be home." End quote. While no one knows for sure what exactly happened over the course of the next 15 minutes, police have established that the murders occurred around 11:50 p.m. When police arrived on the scene after Erin's friend's 911 call, they found all three victims deceased in the back office area. They had been shot with a handgun, the caliber of which has never been publicly shared. In addition to the murders, police found the safe open and emptied, suggesting that the murders had been committed during or following a robbery. Curiously, police noted that the same bowling alley had actually been burglarized just 6 days before the murders. Police later explained that in the previous burglary, no employees were present, and the suspect had failed to gain entry to the safe, damaging it slightly in the process. Instead, the thief made off with a few cell phones, according to the Denver Post. Obviously, this made investigators consider that the killer may have been the same suspect, this time planning to rob the bowling alley with employees present who could get him into the safe. In hopes of covering the area and canvassing surrounding locations for information, more than 20 investigators were put on the case, with the local police receiving additional investigators from the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office. One of the first people investigators spoke with was Erin Golla's friend, who had, in a manner of speaking, witnessed the crime. According to this friend, whose name has never been publicly released to protect her from the suspect, she arrived at approximately 11:45 p.m. Some 5 minutes later, she heard what she described as loud pops, which investigators believe were the fatal gunshots being fired. Just after 11:50, the witness saw a single man exit the bowling alley. In what can only be described as incredibly disturbing and bizarre, the man made eye contact with the witness before offering what she would later describe as a smirk. The suspect then climbed into a dark-colored, late-model, full-size pickup truck and drove out of the parking lot. He would later be described as a white male, 25 to 35 years of age, approximately 6 feet tall, with a shaved head, clean-shaven face, and stocky build, and he was wearing a long, black trench coat. At the time, the witness had no reason to think anything too out of the ordinary had taken place. But when she entered moments later and discovered the horrifying scene, it became clear that she had likely just had a close encounter with the killer. This, of course, raised certain questions, as the killer had been more than willing to kill Bobby, Erin, and James. What exactly caused him not to open fire on the witness? This is an answer which has never been fully explained. Perhaps he just wanted to get away, but the smirk he shined remains as a haunting reminder of how close to death the witness may have been. While authorities were given one description by this witness, canvassing resulted in another vastly different description. While police fully believe the man seen exiting the bowling alley was the killer, several witnesses later reported seeing an unidentified man speaking with James and Erin in the hour before the bowling alley closed. This man was described as being a white male between the ages of 46 and 55, standing 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet 1 inch tall. The man had a medium build, a dark or olive complexion, and reportedly had bushy black hair, a mustache, and he wore black-rimmed glasses. Police would later issue a composite sketch of this individual, noting that while they were not sure he was involved in the crime, they believed he could have information vital to the investigation, as he had been in the bowling alley in the hour prior to the murders. Examination of the scene provided investigators with few pieces of evidence outside of spent shells. We do know that authorities obtained a DNA sample from the crime scene, which they believe belongs to the shooter, though they can't confirm that. Being that it's a bowling alley which has a lot of people moving through it at any given time, it's entirely possible that sample could be unrelated. Regardless, police would move on to test that sample against several people to determine whether or not they may have been present in the bowling alley that night. When asked about DNA samples, Littleton Police Sergeant Trent Cooper told the Denver Post, quote, "This case is different from a lot of homicide cases where we have a direction to go in. This one is just a stone-cold whodunit, and we're trying to cover every angle. Because of that, we have requested evidence from a lot of different people." End quote. In addition to the aforementioned evidence, an article in the Rocky Mountain News noted that police had found 2 jackets, harmonicas, and a tube of neosporin at the crime scene. Whether or not these items were directly connected to the killer has never been specified. According to several later articles, the identity of anyone who may have owned either of the two jackets was never determined, and the jackets were never claimed by anyone and remain in the possession of authorities. Based on interviews and examination of the scene, police managed to construct a scenario by which they believe the crimes took place. According to their analysis, the bowling alley had cash and several personal checks on hand. They believe that once the killer entered the alley, he produced a handgun and forced James, Erin, and Bobby into the back office. At gunpoint, James opened the safe, at which time the killer took all of the cash and checks. Moments later, for reasons unknown, the killer opened fire, leaving no witnesses alive. Investigators from both the police department and district attorney's office, who went over the evidence multiple times, found themselves perplexed. If indeed the killer was the same person who had attempted to burglarize the bowling alley 6 days earlier, his behavior had dramatically changed. As they put it, someone who enters a business after hours and attempts a burglary has a different mentality than someone who's willing to rob a business while people are present. Whereas a burglar typically wants to go unseen and unheard, in this instance, the killer seemed focused on getting whatever he could out of the safe, and killing the 3 victims seemed almost like part of his plan. People are often killed during robberies for one reason or another, but in this instance, investigators had a suspicion that there was no way Bobby, Erin, or James were going to survive that night, and before he walked into the bowling alley, the killer had already made up his mind that the night was going to end in bloodshed. Police would go on to express that they were unsure if they were looking at a local who had specifically targeted that bowling alley, or if maybe they were dealing with someone from outside of Littleton who had selected the location at random. Jennifer Springer grew concerned that night when James hadn't arrived home when she expected him to. Thinking maybe he was running late, Jennifer continued to wait until her concerns overwhelmed her. Picking up the phone, she called some friends and asked if they could go by the bowling alley and see if James was still there. By the time they arrived, they saw police all over the parking lot and knew something was wrong. Not long after, Jennifer was notified that her husband had been killed. At just 25, she was now a widow set to raise 2 children without their father. James' parents were crushed by the news, acknowledging that James had taken the job to provide a better and safe life for his family. They were all set to visit the next weekend to celebrate James' father's birthday. For Erin Golla, it was a devastating blow to learn of his daughter's murder. Just 7 months prior, he had lost his wife of 33 years to a battle with cancer. His daughter-in-law had passed away 2 years prior, also after a struggle with cancer. Golla went on to describe Erin as a sweet person and a good daughter who had never caused any problems. Friends and family of Bobby Zajac couldn't help but be deeply hurt by the news of his murder. They described him as a talented young man with a bright future, someone who loved to have fun and who would be sorely missed. In the aftermath, the frustration with a lack of developments was clear for the families as well as investigators. Lieutenant Mike Broadhead later explained to the Denver Post, quote, "Without question, it's the single most frustrating case I've ever worked on." End quote. In terms of motive, police initially believed they were dealing with a robbery, with the murders being secondary, though many disagreed, feeling that the murder was always part of the plan. A grisly crime which would occur in March, nearly 2 months after the triple homicide, caused investigators to turn their attention to the possibility that there could be a direct connection. On Tuesday, March 26th, a group of friends walking on a bluff overlooking Bonnie Doon Beach in Santa Cruz, California, made the horrifying discovery of 3 bodies. According to the Fresno Bee, police ultimately determined that it was the scene of a double murder-suicide. 26-year-old David Arthur Bachman had apparently shot his girlfriend, 19-year-old Melinda Layup, and their mutual friend, 19-year-old Brenda White, before taking his own life. Police explained that, according to their analysis, the 3 were sitting around a sleeping bag on the bluff when Bachman produced a sawed-off Remington Sportsman 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Both Layup and White were shot at point-blank range, once to the back of the head, before Bachman turned the gun on himself. While police were trying to determine a motive for the crime, no note was left behind. They conducted an extensive look into their 3 lives and found that they were close friends, Layup being Bachman's girlfriend, and they had all attended high school together in Lake Tahoe. In mid-2000, Bachman and Layup moved to Colorado and were followed by White in August of the same year. According to a 13-page report issued by a coroner's investigation, Bachman apparently told the 2 women that he had won $5,000 in the lottery, money which was going to be used to start a new life with Layup in Littleton, Colorado. The 3 then took a trip to Santa Cruz, planning to return to Colorado the day after they were killed. What perhaps makes this situation even more curious is that mysterious $5,000. Investigators were able to confirm that Bachman had not in fact won money in the lottery, nor had he been offered a job, which he also told the 2 women prior to their trip. Analysis of their bank account showed that the couple had little to no money and the bills were piling up. This seems to suggest that the $5,000 either never existed or they had spent it prior to their deaths. So, how does this connect to the triple homicide? Lieutenant Mike Broadhead later explained that during the investigation into the double murder-suicide, investigators had come to Littleton, where the 3 had lived. It was during this time that they were able to determine that just days before the murders of Bobby, Erin, and James, Bachman, Layup, and White had all been present at the Broadway Lanes playing pool. Since there didn't appear to be a solid motive for Bachman's crimes, police theorized this could have spun out of the triple murder, maybe with Bachman having been involved. While no official number has ever been released, I would be extremely curious to know if the amount taken from Broadway Lanes was estimated to be anywhere near $5,000. In hopes of trying to narrow down the scope of that investigation, police were able to obtain DNA samples from Bachman's parents, though testing showed it did not match the DNA found at the bowling alley. While this seemed to rule Bachman out as the potential killer, police once again made note of the fact that they could not conclusively prove that the DNA they had actually belonged to the killer. Moving beyond this possibility, police began examining other theories. While they did not originally have any reason to believe any one particular person had been targeted by the killer, the actions of a grand jury would later raise questions about that. In the months following the murders, a grand jury had been convened to examine a methamphetamine ring operating in the area, according to the Denver Post. During the course of that investigation, Erin Golla's name came up. When asked about this, Sergeant Cooper acknowledged that Erin's name had come up during the investigation, but specified that due to her murder, they really didn't have any way to know exactly in what way she was connected, if she was connected at all. Cooper explained, quote, "There is a connection, but we're not able to talk to her now, so we can't fully explore what her involvement was. There is some indication that she was involved with meth to some degree. We can confirm that. We don't know if she was a recreational user or something more." End quote. Interestingly, at least 2 people were later indicted for being connected to that ring, those being Linda Sesser and her husband William. The couple would ultimately receive probation for their involvement. A lawyer representing the Sesser family expressed that the couple did know Erin, and they hoped that her killer or killers would eventually be captured. While no evidence seems to exist which could directly link Erin to anything which would have warranted her murder, it is interesting to note that in 2007, 5 years after the triple homicide, police sought and obtained a DNA sample from Robert Sesser. When asked if they believed he could have been involved, Sergeant Cooper explained, quote, "The person we got the samples from is not any more of a suspect than anyone else. In reviewing the case, we realized we did not have his DNA." End quote. If indeed that DNA was compared to the sample taken from the crime scene, no further actions have taken place, which either suggests that there was not a match, or investigators don't have enough evidence to definitively state that their sample belongs to the killer. Due to the details involving the grand jury investigation in the years since, there's been a lot of speculation that the robbery and triple homicide could in some way be connected to that meth ring. While police have never been able to confirm in what way Erin could have been involved, some have theorized that there may have been an issue involving money, which could have made her a target. If that is the case, though, no evidence has ever been produced to support it. It has now been 18 long, painful years for the families. Throughout that time, multiple agencies have been involved, including the Littleton Police, Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office, Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. Over the years, police have received more than 100 tips. They've obtained DNA samples from multiple individuals, but they've never found what they need to bring an answer to get justice for the families and to see someone punished for this horrible crime. Littleton detective Russ Hoffman discussed some of the tips they received, telling the Rocky Mountain News, quote, "We've received a lot of tips. Some people we were told were responsible were in jail, so obviously they were not responsible. Some we checked out and they had solid alibis. We think about the case all the time. Somebody knows something, they're just not telling us." End quote. Detective Sam Mullins of the Littleton Police was interviewed in January of 2019, some 17 years after the murders. Mullins expressed the department's determination to solve the crime and emphasized that it was their belief someone other than the killer is out there with information which could help break open the case. Mullins would go on to tell Fox 31 Denver, quote, "In any cold case you get tips. The question is, what's the validity of the tip and how do we go about going through and determining where that tip is going to lead us? People may think, how minuscule what I may know, a minor detail from that evening. There's never a minor detail. Any detail is important to us in these types of investigations." End quote. 18 years ago, nearly 19 now, Bobby Zajac, Erin Golla, and James Springer were killed by an armed robber at the Broadway Lanes bowling alley in Littleton, Colorado. After all this time, it's been hard to continue to believe that justice will ever come. Ron Golla, when asked about the case being solved, told the Rocky Mountain News, quote, "It's been a tough time. I kind of have my doubts that it will be in my lifetime, but I have my hopes." End quote. Bobby's father, Roy, also expressed frustration, saying, quote, "If I knew who did it, I would look for them myself." End quote. James' wife, Jennifer, told her children the truth early on and has focused on telling her boys about their father as they've grown up. They've both grown into men in the time that has passed, never learning the truth of who stole their father away from them. Sharon Springer, James' mother, has never received any answers to her questions, nor has the crime ever become less painful. When asked what she would say to the killer, were he identified and charged, Sharon replied, quote, "What was the price for 3 lives? Whatever you purchased with that money, do you still own it? What was it that cost my son his life?" This is truly a horrifying crime, one for which no answers could ever be given. Even were the killer to be captured, tried, and convicted, it's unlikely he could provide a reason that would explain taking the lives of 3 people who happened to be in a bowling alley on a Sunday night. James Springer moved to Littleton against the options of New York and Salt Lake City because he thought it would provide a safer environment. Erin Golla was working to make a living to help support her daughters. Bobby Zajac was just bowling, something he loved to do. No one could have imagined how it would end for them. 18 years ago, a man walked into the Broadway Lanes bowling alley, pulled a gun, and ordered all 3 into the back office. Once James had unlocked the safe, he grabbed up everything that was inside. It was over. He had everything he came for. Yet, for some reason, he opened fire, killing all 3. Moments later, he strode out of the bowling alley, saw Erin's friend who had come to give her a ride, and without a care in the world, knowing exactly what he had done, he smirked and drove off into obscurity. All these years later, and he remains unidentified, maybe moving on to commit other crimes for which he's never been caught. When looking at this case, there's a few theories which have been purported over the years. While some lean towards a random crime, something without any ties to the victims or the location, Others try to establish a link, something which might provide a solid motive. Beginning with the former, we'll tackle investigators' initial theory first, that the crime was random, at least in the sense of the murders themselves, and maybe even the location. 6 days prior to the murders, someone broke into Broadway Lanes in an attempt to get into the safe. According to what we know, the burglar was unsuccessful, damaging the safe but never getting into it. For nearly 2 decades, it's been debated whether or not this first attempt to steal from the bowling alley ultimately led to the night of Sunday, January 27th, when 3 people would lose their lives. It's hard to deny the connection there. Seems somewhat unlikely that someone would try to break into the safe and then just 6 days later, a completely different person would show up and make sure an employee was there to open it. I suppose the question I've always had is, of all the places to rob, why a bowling alley? Maybe it's just me, but if I were making a list of the top 10 places to rob for quick cash, a bowling alley wouldn't make my list. Maybe there was a reason it was selected outside of its connection to any particular person. You don't often see armed guards or security at a bowling alley, so maybe it was a matter of what would be easiest. If you go to rob a gas station, what are the chances an employee has access to a gun or a panic switch? Now, what about a bowling alley? I'm sure there are people working in bowling alleys who are armed, but is it more likely than a gas station? At a gas station, customers pull in all the time. How many people drive into bowling alley parking lots after hours? Was it about the ease with which the crime could be committed, or could it have been a matter of convenience, not just in the crime, but in its location? Broadway Lanes was located at 5485 South Broadway in Littleton. This placed it 1.4 miles south of State Highway 88, which in that area runs east to west. US Route 85 was just a mile to the west, and it runs from the Mexican to Canadian borders. State Highway 177 was just 2 miles to the east and could quickly connect you to Colorado 285, which runs from Denver to New Mexico. Yet another 3 miles to the east would bring you to I-25, which runs from the southern border of New Mexico all the way into Wisconsin. 4 miles to the south would be State Highway 470. That's a lot of different directions to come from, and even more to escape by. Should police be on the way, the killer would have a lot of different options to choose for a rapid escape to avoid their pursuit. Now, I wouldn't expect a bowling alley to have a lot of money on hand, but if you knew they didn't make deposits until Monday, maybe you'd imagine they had a busy weekend and it would be easier to rob a bowling alley versus a store or a club. Maybe I'm just uninformed, but how many bowling alleys are prepared for the eventuality of a robbery? Clubs, banks, gas stations, stores, they often have a lot of surveillance cameras. Maybe bowling alleys do now, but in all the bowling alleys I've gone to, I've never seen one. So, was that it? It was random, and this person just happened to select Broadway Lanes versus, say, Bellevue Lanes located just 3 miles to the northwest? Maybe they had different hours, or maybe the killer had some particular reason to look at Broadway. You've really got 2 possibilities. Either the killer was guessing there would be money available at Broadway, or the killer knew what kind of money was inside that safe. The fact that the first burglary attempt was 6 days earlier puts it on Monday, January 21st. If the crime was attempted while they were closed, it's possible to believe the person could have broken in after closing Sunday, but before opening on Monday. To me, that suggests this guy knew there was enough money in that safe for him to attempt the crime. I've always wondered if you could be looking for someone who previously worked there, or maybe someone who knew someone that worked there and had some idea of what kind of money was made over a weekend. The idea of this being completely random just doesn't work for me. So we'll look towards the second theory, that the crime was perpetrated by someone who knew that location. Someone tried to get that money, couldn't, and either another person came along and was willing to kill for it, or that same person decided it was worth killing for. If someone tries to burgle a location and fails, what's the likelihood they're going to return 6 days later if they don't have a specific number in mind? Why not move on to a different bowling alley? No matter how many ways you slice it, I find it very difficult to believe that there was anything random about this. Even if it was specific only in so much as the location, I believe it's much more likely that it was targeted, which tells me the killer had some connection and knowledge of that bowling alley, whether they were just someone who bowled there lived in the area, and knew someone who worked there or had previously worked there themselves. I mean, what's more likely to you? That two separate people made attempts on the same bowling alley within 6 days of each other, or just maybe the same person hit twice, completely at random, or the suspect specifically targeted that location. Typically, when a burglary goes wrong, the perp doesn't return to try again, or if they do, they put a lot of space between their attempts. You'd have to imagine that after the first attempt they might have had some kind of heightened security, or would be paying a little more attention. It seems like an unnecessary risk to hit the same place twice inside of a week. I guess the rub comes in when you look at the difference between the two crimes. Breaking in to try and steal money when no one is there is very different than aggressively confronting 3 people, pulling a weapon, and then killing those 3 people. Could you ever imagine that there would be anything in a bowling alley safe worth killing for? Apparently, this person did. We've never been told exactly how much money was taken, but no matter how much it was, I highly doubt it was worth the risk of life in prison in exchange for 3 murders. Some people have speculated you could be looking at a situation that involves more than one person. Maybe the original burglar failed, and so a partner or associate stepped in to handle it in a much more violent way. We may never know if there was a direct connection between the killer and that bowling alley, and in the absence of that information, authorities expanded outward, looking for any other possible answers. Throughout their investigation, as far as we've been made aware, they had 2 other avenues they explored. The first is connected to a drug ring which was being investigated in the months following the murders. Not a lot of information about the grand jury's been released. Despite searching all over, I couldn't find any actual records of what went down and all of the names involved. We do know, however, thanks to the Denver Post, that Erin Golla had ties to the Sesser family, who were later indicted for some role in a meth ring, which resulted in them being given probation. Because of that, police stated that Erin herself could have been tied in some way, either as a user or perhaps something more. I honestly don't like examining this angle because I don't want to say anything negative about Erin, but I have to go where the evidence leads. I do think it's interesting to note, though, that Erin herself didn't appear to come up in that investigation until after her death. So some people have considered the possibility that Erin, if indeed she had some link to the ring, could have been targeted by the killer. We know police took DNA from a member of the Sesser family, though this didn't happen until 5 years later. Was it really a matter of formality, with police noticing they hadn't done it earlier, or did they have a reason to look in that direction? I've seen some theories that maybe Erin was in the process of cooperating with an investigation, or she was seen as maybe being likely to do so. Other people have argued that Erin could have owed money, and the robbery and murder could be connected to that. Still others have speculated that if Erin spent time around the Sessers, or anyone else with alleged ties to the ring, she may have just mentioned how busy the bowling alley was, and someone got it in their head to try and burgle it before deciding to commit robbery and ultimately homicide. We don't have a lot to work with in this area, though I do want to specify that even if Erin had been involved in drugs in some way, absolutely nothing justifies what happened to her, Bobby, or James. I've seen a lot of victim blaming online, and it's incredibly frustrating to say the least. I suppose the issue becomes, if you're in that world, even if you're dipping a toe into it, you're going to run into people who are willing to do horrible things to get what they want. Someone looking for money to support a drug habit isn't exactly rational, and we've seen many cases in which someone has been killed so that they could continue someone's habit. Ultimately, though, nothing has come of it. The grand jury did their work, some people were indicted, and at the end of the day, there doesn't seem to be anything more. Being that the only people we know for a fact were indicted received probation, it's difficult for me to accept anyone directly connected would have been willing to kill over it. Not to mention, if Erin were a target, why go after her when she had other people with her? It's a very confusing circle to examine because in the end you're always trying to determine whether the bowling alley was the target or if it was someone who was there that night. Truthfully, when it comes to this theory, there's just not enough to work with. However, it seems likely if police could have linked this crime to a drug ring, they'd have done so. Not to mention, if anyone is arrested and is facing a long sentence for drug possession or sale, they're probably going to be more likely to give up information about a triple homicide in exchange for some leniency, but that didn't happen here. So, if we move past the random, and we move past someone who knew the alley, and we continue through the drug connection, the only other angle we've been left with connects to the horrifying actions of David Bachman, who killed his girlfriend and their mutual friend before taking his own life just over a month after. Bachman becomes an interesting figure because we know he lied about having won $5,000 in the days before the murders he later committed. Whether or not that $5,000 actually existed or Bachman was just making up a number, we really don't know. However, we do know that Bachman, Melinda Layup, and Brenda White were in Littleton during the time that these triple murders happened, and they had been in the Broadway Lanes just days prior. Someone who's capable of killing two people and then himself obviously comes across the radar as a person who has the potential to commit a triple homicide. It seems quite clear he didn't have much value for his own life or the lives of people he supposedly cared for, so the lives of 3 people he didn't know weren't likely going to change his mind. Beyond the way Bachman's life ended, there are other pieces of information which could fit. 2 jackets were found at the scene of the crime, 2 jackets whose owners have never been identified. Could those jackets have belonged to Bachman, Layup, or White, or some combination? Maybe. Or maybe they didn't belong to anyone connected to the triple homicide. Police don't seem to know, or if they do, they're not sharing that information. If Bachman had committed the crime, why did he wait until nearly the end of March to leave town? Seems more likely you'd want to get away faster than that. There doesn't appear to be a record of any large expenses at that time. Bills kept piling up, and according to Layup's father, when he saw the trio prior to their deaths, their vehicle was in bad shape and the tires needed to be replaced. Maybe Bachman didn't want to spend money on things he didn't consider fun, or maybe he owed money to other people for other things. There doesn't appear to be any information to show that he ever had or spent $5,000 between January 27th and March 26th. That doesn't mean he didn't, just that it can't be proved. In terms of contradictory information, there's a few things which would seem to rule Bachman out, making the end of his and Layup's and White's lives a tragic coincidence, so to speak. We know the killer used a handgun, but Bachman was known to carry a shotgun, the same shotgun he ultimately killed and took his own life with. In all descriptions of his travel, his vehicle has been described as a car, never a late-model dark-colored full-size truck. If police ever found evidence of him owning such a vehicle or having access to one, it's never been reported publicly. Outside of Bachman having been in the bowling alley, there doesn't appear to be any information to suggest he had any knowledge of how much money was moving through there. Does it seem likely he would attempt to rob the bowling alley one night, go back to play pool a few nights later, and then come back again a few nights after that, committing the robbery and the 3 murders? No, but maybe he just wasn't worried about being caught. When Bachman's family's DNA was tested, it offered no match. On the one hand, that would normally rule someone out, but in this instance, we don't know for sure that the DNA found at the scene actually belongs to the killer. What we do know is that it's never been identified, and while I wish they would submit it to GED Match to find an identity, it may be a process they don't consider worth attempting when they can't actually be sure it belongs to their suspect. We know there were 2 witnesses. One who saw a man speaking with James and Erin an hour or so before closing, and then Erin's friend who saw the killer walking out of the building. One would have to imagine police would have shown photos of Bachman to both witnesses to see if there was a confirmation, and since this has never been mentioned, it seems unlikely that either witness recognized him. He doesn't appear to resemble one of the composite sketches either. So, could Bachman have been responsible? Sure, his actions have shown that killing didn't seem to matter to him. But there's certainly a lot of questions that could lead you to believe he wasn't the killer. Also, at the end of the day, you've got a police department that wants to find an answer, and if they had a way to connect Bachman to the triple murder, I believe they would have done so. So it becomes a matter of what you believe. A random crime, a targeted crime, a connection to a drug ring, or a connection to a murderer. Enough information to consider all possibilities, not enough information to pin it to one specific person. What do you think? Does one of these theories hold the answers, or is there something more which has been missed, something which might be able to explain this? Bobby Zajac, Erin Golla, and James Springer needlessly lost their lives at the hands of a cold-blooded killer who ultimately killed them in exchange for the contents of a safe in a bowling alley. In so many cases, we've seen people killed for little to no reason, and it doesn't seem all that different here. I can't begin to comprehend what it must be like to lose a loved one in such a mindless incident, and I truly can't imagine taking a job at a bowling alley and ever thinking it could come to this. This is a controversial case full of questions with no answers. One thing, though, that most people tend to agree on, someone out there knows what happened, and after nearly 20 years, it's time for someone to come forward. Leave an anonymous tip, send an email, text Crime Stoppers. Unfortunately, unless that DNA eventually matches someone, a legitimate tip is delivered or someone confesses. The triple homicide of Bobby Zajac, Erin Golla, and James Springer will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the Littleton bowling alley triple homicide, there are some articles available, but they're difficult to find and they're almost all from 2002 and 2003. I know that America's Most Wanted ran 2 segments on this case, though I was never able to locate the footage of that coverage. If you have any information about the murders of Bobby Zajac, Erin Golla, and James Springer, please contact the Littleton Police Department at 303-794-1551. You can also contact Metro Denver Crime Stoppers at 720-913-7867. You can go to the website metrodenvercrimestoppers.com/anonymous-tip if you want to report your information anonymously. There is currently a $2,000 reward available for information in this case. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or comment in the Facebook group. Did you know that CrimeCon is coming to the United Kingdom and will be in London on June 12th and 13th, 2021? And I'll be there representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row. I'm really looking forward to being a part of this amazing event. And if you're considering going, you can use the promo code TRACE21 for 10% off your ticket. That's TRACE21 for 10% off. Visit crimecon.co.uk for more information. Trace Evidence would not be possible without the amazing support of you incredible listeners. So I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers. Special thanks to Alicia Lorraine, Ann Bertram, Astrid Nair, Brittany Bivens, Brian Kemmerling, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, D'Earthy, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Jennifer Winkler, Joni Berkowitz, Kevin Bonham, Michael Draves, Nick Mohar Schurz, Pamela Coburn, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Mascaritolo, Travis Skepko, Stephanie Eve, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, and Tracy Woods. You're all amazing and your contributions are greatly appreciated, as are all patrons. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or visit trace-evidence.com for further information. I want to thank you all for listening, and for those of you who will be celebrating, I wanted to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Today, I'm going to leave you with a promo for a podcast that I think you might be interested in. It's called The Shattered Window Podcast, and it takes a deep dive into the 1988 murder of Jacqueline de Wallaby. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.
The murder of Jacqueline de Wallaby is a tragedy that has puzzled and polarised the minds of those who know it. Over the past 6 months, we've extensively investigated this case, trawling through files, trial transcripts, and archives, and have been conducting interviews with the people who lived through it.
It was a sensational, startling fact that a 7-year-old little girl had shown up missing from a suburban home.
Something like that happening would have never crossed our parents' minds.
The notion that a stranger can slip into a child's bedroom in the middle of the night, completely undetected, is surely a notion that every single parent on this earth fears. But what's even more lamentable is knowing that a child killer is roaming the street, and even more chilling, they could be someone you know.
Hosted by Emily G. Thompson and Eileen McFarlane, this is The Shattered Window.